Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present here tonight. I would also like to recognize that we are on unceded land, and that the Indigenous people have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for more than 60,000 years, and our first teachers and educators. Furthermore, I acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledges in academy. So, welcome everybody, and welcome to the second Dean's Lecture in 2025, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all, and it's wonderful to see so many faces and so many colleagues and friends. My name is Marek Tesar, I'm professor here, and I'm also the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. So, tonight's lecture is very special. It has been highly anticipated and is gathering a great deal of interest. So much so that we had to move our lecture to a larger theatre within the university, and we thank the Melbourne Law School for accommodating us tonight. We are very excited to welcome Professor Guy Claxton, who has travelled all the way from UK to Australia for various activities, including the speaking opportunity with us here tonight. I would like to acknowledge Professor Sandra Milligan, Executive Director of Melbourne Metrics at our Faculty of Education, for nominating Guy to deliver this Dean's Lecture. And I thank her in advance also for delivering tonight's vote of thanks. Following Guy's presentation, there will be time for audience participation, and which will be facilitated by our Deputy Dean of Education, Professor Lindsay Oates. I urge you to consider questions for Guy for later discussion as you listen to his talk. So we are very delighted to announce that while Guy is in town, he has also recorded an episode of the Faculty of Education Talking Teaching podcast. In its 9th season, Talking Teaching is positioned in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide, which is a great achievement for our faculty and for the work that we're doing and for the work the the special is doing. I encourage you to sign up to our Faculty of Education events and news mailing list using the QR code displayed on the screen to ensure you are the first to know of the Guy's episode release. I would also like to take the opportunity now to tell you about Guy and his amazing career thus far. Guy Claxton is a cognitive scientist by training and writer of over 30 books on psychology and education. He holds fellowships of the British Psychological Society and the Academy of Social Sciences, and took a double first in natural sciences from Cambridge and a DPhil in experimental psych from Oxford. Guy has spent most of his working life in a variety of UK institutions, including Oxford, Bristol, UCL, King's College, and Winchester. He is currently Emeritus Professor of the Learning Sciences at Winchester Centre for Real-World Learning and Honorary Senior Research Fellow at Bristol. Guy's work really focuses on teaching and researching about real life, as well as academic learning, what it involves, and how to make it better. He now works directly with school teachers to deliberately create cultures in their classrooms that strengthen these so-called positive learning dispositions or epistemic strengths. In Australia, over many years, Guy has led research and development programs for the Victorian Independent Schools Association, the Anglican Schools of New South Wales, and the South Australian Department of Education. So, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Professor Guy Claxton to the stage for this Dean's Lecture titled, The Science of Learning. What does it really tell us about teaching? Guy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marek. Thank you to Sandra for making this possible. And thank you all for turning out. I was slightly overwhelmed when I became aware of the interest in this lecture, and a little bit intimidated, I have to say. The science of learning, what does it really tell us about teaching? I'll tell you in a minute what the content is going to be. But before then, I need to do a little bit of expectation management. Right, yeah, that's the right slide. Before I came out, not long before I came out, I had to undergo some treatment for bladder cancer. And as a result of the general anesthetic and the hefty dose of poisonous chemo, I'm still a little bit wobbly, a little bit of cognitive fog, I think. And the main manifestation of that is that I often find when I'm talking about something terribly interesting, I stop for a fraction of a second and lose my thread. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this phenomenon. So I'm going to ask for some help, and as there's a row of very distinguished professors in the front, I thought I would deputize them as people who might rescue me if I lose my thread. It might also be a way of keeping them awake. So, thank you very much for coming, and let me get on with what the content of the lecture are. It's a limited argument. I'm not going to take on any particular people or any particular school. I wrote a book about 3 years ago called The Future of Teaching and the Myths That Hold It Back, in which I did that job as to the best of my ability, and I'm not going to reproduce that tonight. I thought what it might be more useful would be to try and give you, those of you who are not already specialists, a broad introduction to what is going on in the science of learning. These are the things I just wanted to get out of the way at the beginning. I'm not to be positioned as a binary, bipolar progressive. I'm not against expository teaching in its right place. I mean, this is an example. This event is an example of expository teaching, but it's appropriate because you're all adults who are free to come or not, and you've come presumably because you think there's something that you might find interesting or illuminating in being here. That's not the case in schools, of course. So it's one of the things I will argue is that it's a big jump to go from the sometimes appropriateness of a group of people sitting quietly and politely being told things by someone else to assuming that such forms of teaching are somehow the dominant or the mandatory forms of teaching in places of education. The two questions that I want to address then, the limited argument that I want to make today, is there such a thing as the science of learning? The definite article there makes a strong claim, doesn't it? It makes a claim that there is something which is the science of learning and that it's agreed and it's unequivocal. The science of learning, there it is. We've discovered the most important things that need to be known, and they're beyond question that they are, in a sense, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth of the nature of learning. So that's one question. And the second question is, even if there were an agreed science of learning, does it mandate a particular style of teaching? Can we make the jump from the what is of the scientific enterprise to the what ought to be of the pedagogical enterprise? I thank Marek very much for his kind introduction, so I don't need to do much about establishing my credentials here. Thank you very much for rehearsing some of my history. In a way, I think that's important, although it runs the risk of, I'm not sure if this is an Australian or a Kiwi word, it runs the risk of skiting. But I think it is important because I have come across some people who know very little about the science of learning, but seem to think that they know all about it. This may be just my attempt at self-aggrandizement. There's some of the books on the subject that I've written over the years, Cognitive Psychology, an edited collection way back in 1980 that was published. How much is that? 45 years ago or more, maybe. Live and Learn, about 10 years after that. Creativity, Wisdom, Trusteeship, a nice little book that I wrote jointly with Howard Gardner and the late Anna Kraft, The Future of Teaching. And but in my other guise, well, not educational guise, I've been writing a lot and working on the ideas around non-intellectual and in some cases non-conscious forms of intelligence, which resulted in about 5 years ago a book called Intelligence in the Flesh, Why your mind needs your body much more than it thinks, published by Yale University Press. So I know a bit about what I'm talking about, I think. The first point to make, I think, is that there very definitely isn't a single science of learning. There are sciences of learning. We need to insert the plural. Just a brief list here of some of the contributory disciplines which often lead in surprisingly different directions, yet they all are forms of academic, scholarly, and in large measure empirical inquiry which bear on our understanding of learning. Not just cognitive neuroscience, but the huge explosion of work in affective and social neuroscience. AI and robotics have a good deal to say in this area. Philosophy, the great late Daniel Dennett was a great influence, and I believe was working on a book about the philosophy of learning when he sadly passed away a few years ago. Sociocultural psychology takes us again in a different direction, concerned with things that we ought to be concerned with in the classroom, the sociocultural context of learning. Cognitive anthropology, very interesting work. Developmental psychology, obviously. Embodied cognition, which is of great interest to me at the moment and to many people in the cognitive sciences, as a way of empirically insisting about the reuniting of the reconsidering the united nature of body and mind, evolutionary psychology in many different forms, and indeed information processing psychology and instructional psychology. But as you see from the list, they are only two aspects, two pockets, if you like, two strata of what's going on in the science of learning. The science of learning wasn't invented to say things about school. We can maybe draw inferences, but that wasn't their original purpose. So I think we have to start by saying there's no such thing as the science of learning. We have a variety of scholars working from different directions on understanding the nature, the purpose, the function, the evolutionary roots of the learning that we seem to have. I think we need to add another S as well. Sometimes people talk naively about the science of learning as if learning was one thing, as if we need one theory to cover the whole gamut of that. But there are lots of different aspects of learning. Just as there are a lot, I have trouble with the notion of problem solving when people talk as if it was a single thing that you can teach children. I think fixing the fault in your bicycle and fixing the fault in your marriage have very little in overlapping, although some people might operate as if they were more similar than they really are. Mostly men. Skill development, perceptual learning, learning to tell a Bordeaux from a Burgundy. Learning to learn, one of my own particular areas of study. Learning to develop attitudes, values, and interests, identity formation, identity development. Certainly information retention and retrieval has to be in that list. Deeper understandings, learning a part in a play, which is a rather complex process, which is received a fair bit of research recently and is very interesting. Making and performing, again, is different from many other subjects in school. And, of course, school maths and science. But we need to ask very carefully whether theories that have been proposed and which may give you some grip on school-based learning in science and mathematics, whether they legitimately form a prototype for looking at all other subjects in the school curriculum. And there may be reasons for supposing that that's not quite the part. So I thought I would introduce you to some real-life scientists, some real-life learning scientists, who you may or may not have heard of, but are not often talked about or referenced in some of the works that propound the idea that the science of learning is single and unitary and more or less cut and dried. Let me introduce you first to Roger Schank, who's the godfather of the learning sciences, actually. He invented the title, the phrase, the learning sciences. He was originally professor of psychology and AI at Yale and went on to Northwestern University in Chicago to be the founder of the very first Institute for the Learning Sciences, co-founder of the Journal of Cognitive Science. So he has some claim to the title of being the godfather of the field. But let me just illustrate the breadth of views, the breadth of conclusions that someone with his wealth of experience and of experimental work in the area has come to conclude. These are just a couple of clips from the web of some of his statements. If you want to follow up on him, he has a wonderful book called Education Outrage, which I strongly recommend to you as a way of broadening the mind. Learning is about failure and recovery from failure. Recovery from failure is an essential part of learning, he's saying, not the avoidance of failure by being clever. Sometimes in schools there is a strange idea which percolates around that the working definition of brightness is being able to do everything quickly and correctly the first time without making mistakes, without breaking sweat, and doing that always. And this is mistaken for intelligence, or it's at least a rather narrow view of intelligence when you consider how many great works of our culture, of our literature, and our science were the products of people who were self-admittedly slow learners. Beethoven was a slow learner. Shakespeare was a slow learner. Ken Robinson has a nice bit of whimsy in one of his TED Talks about Shakespeare looking out of the window, desperately chewing the end of his quill, not knowing how to finish the third act of As You Like It, and so on. This is a more interesting quotation. Oh, there's another one. Learning happens when, this sounds rather progressive, doesn't it? Learning happens when someone wishes to learn, not when someone wishes to teach, which would come as a surprise to a few teachers. On learnable and cognition and agency, this is just beginning to open up some of the other areas that may not always be acknowledged when people start talking about the learning sciences. And we might begin to find that the implications or the possibilities which are opened up by the sciences of learning may be more radical and in some ways more unsettling or more challenging at least than some of the other readings of the learning sciences. A properly designed school system needs to focus on cognitive abilities, not scholarly subjects. Cognitive abilities, not scholarly subjects. What does he mean by that? We'll unpack that when we look at the next of my heroes and heroines in the world of the learning sciences. But here's the next heretical thought. If we allow students to choose what areas of knowledge they would like to focus on while learning those skills, they would be attentive and interested. It's an article of faith, but it may be an article of faith worth entertaining. He's advocating a strong move away from a wall-to-wall mandated curriculum. But notice also that he's clarifying a little bit what he means by those cognitive abilities when he treats them as skills, while learning those skills. And now we're embarking on an understanding which is a bit different from the traditional folk psychology that has certainly informed my education, that the major sources of difference between people learning things quickly and easily and not, often interpreted as their intelligence, was a reflection of a fixed form of intelligence, which was more or less, to a large and satisfactory extent predetermined by your genetic makeup and by the amount of effort they put in, often kind of with a little get-out clause at the end about whether they might have trouble at home or have got in with a bad crowd. But that was often the depth of the folk psychology that was circulated in schools. But what Schank is beginning to offer us is a different notion, the notion that cognitive abilities, some of them, perhaps many of them, are learnt skills. That these are not, that children's performance in school is not a valid or direct indicator of some general purpose, ubiquitous cognitive ability, but that cognition develops. Cognition is made up of learnt modules, but we will come back to that. So that's the grand old man. He passed away, I'm afraid, about 2 or 3 years ago, I think, but he was a major influence on founding and establishing the original direction of the learning sciences. Now I thought I'd take you to a friend of mine, Cecilia, or known to her friend as Celia Hayes, professor of psychology, member of Don at All Souls College, University of Oxford. That's pretty high in terms of academic achievement. And this is her talking in her wonderful book, if you want a primer of this new way of thinking about the learnability of the mind. I strongly recommend her Harvard University Press book, Cognitive Gadgets, which is the same kind of ballpark as Schank was talking about when he referred to those learnable skills. And in this book she writes, "We humans have created mechanisms of thought embodied in our nervous systems that enable our minds to go further, faster, and in different directions than the minds of any other animals. They are passed on," that's proposition 1, which she very carefully reviews the evidence for. Then the next interesting thing is, these cognitive gadgets, as she calls them, are passed on to subsequent generations through social learning. As Vygotsky, the great Russian psychologist Vygotsky, didn't quite say, but he meant to say, you pick up your mind from the people you hang out with. So be careful who you hang out with. When you're little, you don't have much choice about that. But there is a major area of learning which is about the contagious, unintentional, subconscious transmission and formulation of the way your own mind works. How you think, how you learn, how you reason are things which may be part of your upbringing. And then Celia goes on to speculate. She's not an educationist, but she speculates, I think very interestingly, and I'll pick this up later, in future the cultural inheritance of cognitive mechanisms, which in traditional societies would have been passed on in this informal social way, could be enhanced by formal education. It may be possible to design training programs for use in schools to improve cognitive skills. Now, it may be an article of faith for some people that most schools more or less do that already. And I will argue a little later on that the evidence is very strong, somewhere between very strong and unequivocal, that they absolutely don't do that already. In fact, sometimes instead of helping young people become equipped with what the professor of embodied cognition, Andy Clark, I was going to say countryman of mine, but he's a Scot rather than English, refers to as cognitive upgrades. It's the same kind of area. But these cognitive upgrades, again, are things which are passed on. And again, Andy Clark speculates in one of his books, I think it's the book, an early, wonderful book of his called Being There, that education could be focused around the explicit, the curriculum would be a curriculum of mental, physical and emotional and epistemic, most importantly, development, rather than the acquisition, the handing on of bodies of knowledge. Of course, there has to be some things that we're applying our developing capacities to. You can't learn to hammer without having a hammer and some nails, and that's a misapprehension that has circulated in some areas of the education world, that somehow people who advocate, who talk about the learning of cognitive skills, must therefore be arguing against the importance of subject knowledge, of content, as if there was some necessary tug of war between these two valuable goals, as if they were at odds with each other. That if you advocate somehow or other the development of learning skills or learning competencies or learning dispositions is a common word, that must somehow automatically mean that you no longer cared about quadratic equations and Shakespeare and the periodic table, which is an absurd contention. So that's Cecilia Hayes. Now let's move across the pond to the University of... have I gone on to one too far? No, wait a minute. Yes. To the University of Southern California. A rising, perhaps I should say risen star in the field of the relationship between psychology, education, and neuroscience. As you see, that's the title of her professorship, Mary Helen Imordino Yang, who learned her craft with both Antonio Damasio, a name you may be familiar with as the author of Descartes' Error, a very influential neurologist and neuroscientist, and Howard Gardner at Harvard. And this is another a sample of what's come out of her work, her very careful work, trying to link the understanding of brain growth and brain structures with what goes on in the educational world. It's her contention that it's fairly obvious that there is a fundamental mismatch between secondary education and the way kids learn. Hold the front page. In school, we want kids to start with the small building blocks, to learn the little pieces and start to put them together. There is often an assumption, isn't it, that you can't move on to X before you've done Y and Z. Some people have even argued that you can't move on to thinking about things until you've acquired a large body of knowledge, presumably unthought about, at the point of entry. It's an argument that I've come across in some places. But her research shows strongly that that's not how the human mind grows. And this is an interesting statement. It grows by engaging with deep, powerful ideas and questions, and then working backwards to inform the meaning that you're making. It's a reverse process. It just reminds me that David Perkins, in one of his books, talks about the importance of not atomizing learning, not turning it into what he calls the twin diseases of aboutism, always just talking about things rather than learning to do them, and what he refers to as elementitis, that everything has to be built up like Lego from little bricks of knowledge before you can really get to work on them. But she's saying that we do things differently. It grows by engaging with deep, powerful ideas and questions and working backwards. Supporting young people, this is her most recent research, supporting young people to engage with the complexities of their moral and social lives is what is deeply, deeply motivating, and it is what grows their brains. Some lovely studies she's been doing recently of doing detailed, quite long, two-hour interviews with 15 and 16-year-olds, many or most of them from deprived backgrounds, showing them videos of exemplary and interesting young people like Malala, I've put a photo of here, but many others, and then having a gentle but extended conversation with them about what thoughts that video sparked in them, what aspirations they had, what they cared about in their communities, what they would like to be able to help with as they were growing up. They were brain scanned, and 2 years later, the kids who had been through that process, who'd been gently but powerfully primed to think about, what's her phrase, the deep, powerful ideas and questions and the complexities of their own moral and social lives, showed a distinctive advantage in the development of their own brains, showed a significant boost to brain growth by that process. Now, that doesn't prove everything by itself, but it's a very interesting and different kind of information that's coming out of the laboratory. Next in my list is Lauren Resnick, Director of the Learning and Development Research Center at the University of Pittsburgh, past President of the American Education Research Association. I put one of her books up here about education and learning to think, again from the assumption that ordinary, may I say, traditional forms of education do not automatically create that capacity. But this is slightly sideways to that, this statement. Well, let's take the first one, which follows the line of thought, which I've already been picking out for you. In a very influential short paper written some 20 or 30 years ago now, called Making Americans Smarter. Didn't work, did it? She writes pithily, intelligence is the sum total of our habits of mind. Now, that raises a whole lot of questions. What are the habits of mind? How do you identify them? How are they integrated? And how are they acquired? But the word habits is an interesting one. And school is an ideal place for shaping habits, isn't it? You go there for a large proportion. 15,000 hours is the rough estimate of your young life. A large proportion of your waking time, so that it's an ideal environment in which we could, if we wished, design an education which is specifically around the shaping of mental habits. But this is what she picks out here as a contrast between, again, what we might call standard education and something that is bubbling away as an alternative. As long as school focuses mainly on individual forms of competence, on tool-free performance, and on decontextualized skills, just for a moment, think about your own schooling or school of your children and see whether those strictures continue to apply. Of course, we do a bit of group work, but how important is it? How well designed is it? How does it progressively expand young people's capacity to be good interlocutors, good sounding boards for each other? That's not so common. As long as school focuses mainly on those characteristics, educating people to be good learners in school settings alone may not be sufficient to help them become strong out-of-school learners. In another paper she wrote in the American Psychologist, which very clearly delineates between the strong differences between the kinds of learning, the organization of learning, the way learning is designed, mandated, structured in school, is in many respects very different from much of what people meet in their learning lives outside of school. But we'll leave that where it is. I think the last of my heroes is a personal hero of mine and a personal friend, I'm pleased to say. David Perkins, a now emeritus professor like me, but from Harvard Graduate School of Education, one of the co-founders, probably less well known in many quarters than Howard Gardner, of Project Zero. This is his book, Making Learning Whole, which should be required reading for anybody who wants to talk about the learning sciences. He writes and thinks absolutely beautifully. He's a meticulous writer and thinker. He writes very clearly and simply, but with great insight and great grace. His books themselves are fine examples, maybe fine examples of how rare such qualities are. A clarity, a simplicity, a depth, and a self-effacement as well in terms of his writing. But he's writing in one of his books on collaboration. Hardly anything we do is done solo. No matter whether you're an athlete, a business person, a scientist, a trash collector, or a clerk, you're almost always coordinating with other people in a complex way. Human endeavor is deeply and intrinsically collective. Human learning is deeply and intrinsically collective, everywhere except in schools. I wanted to pop Piaget into this list because I think he can, somewhat mistakenly, be blamed for some of the concerns that are being expressed in many of the states in Australia, certainly, about things that we need to think or rethink about education. Of course, it's common to point out that he wasn't a developmental psychologist, he was a genetic epistemologist. He was interested in the way in which different kinds of learning and knowing, particularly rationality and scientific ways of knowing, the way they appear, the way they arise. He was perfectly content with the idea that new knowledge emerges out of existing knowledge through processes that he called accommodation and assimilation. Importantly, new ways of knowing emerge out of earlier ones, and these are his famous stages. But, and this is the most important thing, that Piaget never admonished educators to go from that understanding into the idea that it is our job to rush children through that developmental sequence as quickly as possible and to encourage them to kick away the ladder of the earlier stages as they reached the high ground of formal operations. On the contrary, the earlier stages continue to function, continue to develop, and much of the recent work on embodied cognition shows beyond a shadow of doubt that our forms of higher cognition retain a deep and often quite automatic grounding in the sensory motor, in the physical, in the actual, in the emotional, in the embodied stuff of our being. So it's a mistake, and I think an injustice to Piaget, but it's had a very powerful force on the way in which our education is shaped, hasn't it? Even in primary schools, there seems to sometimes to be that rush. Certainly in old-fashioned schools, as soon as we can get them sitting in little desks, isolated, facing the front, shaping their letters, moving away from, as the Bible put it, when I grew up, I put away childish things. And these earlier ways of knowing have been treated as if they were childish things to be transcended. But our understanding now is that the latter are not in any sense superior to the earlier. They are dependent on them and reliant and continually intermingled with those more bodily processes. The latter do not supersede the earlier ones, and our job is certainly not to prioritize the development of formal operations as we go along. So there is a bit of a groundswell going on, which I hope some of those pen portraits might have laid the ground for. In terms of, this is a rather crude table contrasting information processing psychology. When I was doing my PhD, I was very much in that school. The digital computer was a relatively new invention, and as always in psychology and many other sciences, people are scratching around for good metaphors to get a handle on what it is that you're trying to understand, and the computer came to hand. It's come to be called or referred to as cold cognition. In other words, the undergraduate topics that took precedence in my day were reasoning, thinking, memory, decision-making, and so on. Those were the chapter headings, and that was the high-status, state-of-the-art psychology. And I remember at Oxford that social psychology, developmental psychology, what was called in those days abnormal psychology, didn't even have a place in the main building of the high ground of experimental psychology, which was devoted to animal studies and cognitive psychology alone. So the fundamental cornerstones, the intellectual cornerstones of education, things like how we understand intelligence, how we understand learning, how we understand the nature of memory, the kinds of knowledge that we focus on, are labile, and they are beginning to, what's coming out of many of the laboratories, is that there is a bit of a shift from that rather narrow concern only with the rational and the linguistic and the argumentative, to a concern, to a revised, renewed concern. It was there in the early days, it was there if you read William James, with a concern that the real world of living, of loving, of raising children, what we might now call embodied or warm cognition, a form of cognition that is embroiled with and suffused with emotion, with bodily process, with illness, and so on. So in intelligence, a shift from concern only with the intellect, that eliding of the ideas together, that intelligence basically was intellect, to a more rich and variegated notion of intelligence, not of multiple intelligences, but of a single intelligence containing many facets. That learning is not always or primarily necessarily about the accumulation or retention of information or knowledge, but more about a process of organic growth. And the whole idea that I've been involved in of learning to learn, of seeing learning itself as a learnable craft, is something that is now commonplace in the literature, though not always accepted with joy in schools. The metaphors for memory, the metaphor of memory as a store, memory as a warehouse, memory as a library, memory as an immutable form of architecture, and indeed memory as the hard drive of a digital computer, is giving way to more biologically based notions of memory. The fundamental metaphor in the ascendant now is a neurological metaphor rather than a computational metaphor. So memory is more like a jungle, more like an orchard, more full of things that grow and interweave, of networks. And that knowledge is now not only facts, formulae, proposition, definitions, things that can be marked, in other words, is that it's at least as much about competence, about maxims, and about multiple ways of knowing, aesthetic ways of knowing, intuitive ways of knowing, physiological ways of knowing, and so on, which are emerging quite strongly. I don't have time to tell you a lot about my own involvement with these things. The literatures that I have been involved with from my DPhil onwards were semantic memory. This next slide is a picture in an article, a book chapter that I wrote in 1980, advocating a way of looking at memory as two overlapping planes, one which has a kind of analog topography, which is the plane I now refer to it as the lifescape. It's all the ways in which our neural networks have been shaped and informed by the informal influences of our upbringing. And overlaid on that is the wordscape, which has complex relationships, but has its origins, the meanings of words have to be grounded. The grounding problem, as it's called in cognitive philosophy, always has to suppose that you have to get out of the dictionary somehow. Somewhere you have to find the grounding for the things that you know. The nature of working memory, which has been talked about quite a lot in the context of the science of learning, has changed a lot. Again, that has been taken out of its box and turned into a functional notion of the brain. I won't go through this whole quote, but the bit I've picked out in red is the most important bit. Paper as far back as 2007, getting on for 20 years ago, said working memory is not localized to a single brain region. It's not a box in the brain, but probably, and I think many people would say almost certainly now, is an emergent property of the functional interconnections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. It's a dynamic process. It's not a funnel through which information has to be squeezed in order to get into long-term memory. That image of the relationship between the two kinds of memory, which has driven some kinds of thinking about the nature of teaching and learning, seems to be running out of steam, seems to be past its use-by date, certainly in the parent field of the cognitive learning sciences themselves. Shifting ways of thinking about learning. This is just, I don't have time to go through this, but this is just a way of thinking about conceptualizing development in the ways suggested by Roger Schank and by Cecilia Hayes, that somehow as we grow without knowing it, and as parents often without intending it, that what is happening is that we are installing these cognitive upgrades. I would prefer the word epistemic. I don't like the word cognitive because it carries with it a strong whiff of that concerned predominantly with intellect. And we're in the process now of moving beyond that. So let's say epistemic. So with some misgivings. I've been playing with a computer metaphor of seeing these as upgrades, as Andy Clark calls it. So we're born learning, we're born with a predisposition of the brain to pick up sensory and motor patterns and install them in the functioning of the nervous system. That's, if you like, the factory setting with which we arrive. And then we're installed with the readiness to amplify that setting, to augment it through focusing through the way the brain is designed to zoom in on surprise and disappointment. Learning is driven biologically by surprise and disappointment. Yet often teachers sometimes think that creating surprise is a kind of icing on the cake, and not strictly necessary, rather than the cake itself. Getting that sense of, as many people are saying now, that curiosity is the engine, is the driver of learning. Active exploration and experimentation, imitation and social referencing, some of these things are drawn from the work of people that I've mentioned already. Others are extrapolations, looking at aspects of our cognition as if they were learning amplifiers, as if their primary function was to enable us to give ourselves better answers of what might work when we're stuck, which is a primary function of those amplifiers. The powerful learner is not often stuck for something to do. They have a mind that can say, well, perhaps, or what if, or maybe we could, and you know people like that. You probably are people like that. But you know people who don't have that disposition, who get stuck easily. There are some children in school who get stuck so easily that their hands go up in a rather pathetic fashion before you've even finished telling them what it is that you want them to do sometimes. A sense of easily defeated by difficulty. And then language and so on. And I've mentioned here, and don't have time to go into this, that we also have to allow, some of Carol Dweck's work is relevant here, that maybe, without meaning to, some of these things that get fed in through our social interactions may have a deleterious effect on our functioning as learners. If we get frightened of making mistakes, if we come to believe that our intelligence is a fixed marker of our worth, then when we're finding things difficult, then that becomes a negative experience. And it's very important also to develop, because we necessarily the system will get bugged, will get bugs in it, that we have to develop the capacity for debugging our own mentalities. And that's where things like, obviously, reflection, but the rise of interest in mindfulness is important there. Mindfulness can mean and can do many things, but one of its most powerful functions, and one of its original functions in Buddhism, which I know something about, is that in a state of mindfulness, your own assumptions become visible to you. And instead of being dissolved in your way of functioning and causing mischief in our lives, we, as it were, are able to move the cursor of our awareness upstream of those problems that have got, or those bugs which might have got installed in our own minds. And once they become visible, then they can become questionable. And once they become questionable, they become mutable. And there may be other alternatives. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be teaching that at school. I don't have time to talk about anything about embodiment science. But so you see, my point really is to pick out some. I've homed in on ways in which the learning sciences open up possibilities. Sciences don't tell us what to do, but they do help clear away false assumptions about what not to do. We edge towards more accurate understandings in the life sciences and the cognitive sciences, more accurate understandings of our own mentality. And those more accurate understandings open up not imperatives, but possibilities, new avenues for thinking, for example, about the function of school. So what if school was a place where you go to get good at thinking, learning, and knowing? That it was, if you like, my fancy phrase, an epistemic apprenticeship. Then we would have to start rethinking the apparatus of education, wouldn't we? You need role models. Teachers become master learners, master thinkers, people who live and breathe the qualities that we want children to pick up by being around them in the Vygotskian way. It needs mates, preferably some mates who are a little bit further on than you, as in any form of apprenticeship. It needs tasks that build competence and confidence, feedback on progress, appreciation offered of your growing contribution to the life of the community, if you're an apprentice tailor or an apprentice jeweler, whatever, apprentice thinker. But think how powerful young people would be if they were developing the confidence and being supported in developing the confidence to act on their own idealism and their own frustration with what they see going on in the world. What a resource we may be underusing or even stymieing. Don't schools do that already? No, they don't. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they do partially, but in general, not. A very important research project by, I make no apology for using his name yet again, by David Perkins, a very nice, concise review of this program of research, published in a journal in 2019 to remind us of how important it was, shows that by and large, well, I'll give you the title of an earlier paper of his. The title was Post-Primary Education Has Little Impact on Informal Reasoning. How people use their minds when they're not being sat down at a desk and being constantly reminded of how to use them is not well amplified, not well developed. People develop ways of thinking within their specialisms, but if you ask them general questions about, for example, who to vote for in the election, often the quality of their thinking has not improved. And in some ways, the education has the effect, certainly in the public understanding of science, this research is very well known, that as people acquire more knowledge, particularly in the sciences, they simply become more skilled and more articulate at developing the same mistakes that they made when they were 5 or 6 years old. So we cannot presuppose that the status quo is going to do the job for us. And this is where we have to come to think about values. Because science doesn't tell us what we should do, but it opens up possibilities about what we might do. So there's not time, of course, to go into this here, but we need to go back to basics. Not back to basics in the sense of chalk and talk, but back to basics in really thinking about what are the purposes, declared and undeclared, of education. And only when we've decided on what those desirable outcomes, as the Ministry of Education in Singapore refer to them, the desirable outcomes of education, can we answer the question, what is the good way of teaching? There is no such thing as best practice or good quality teaching. You can't answer that question until you've specified for what. And I think the literature points in the direction that explicit teaching, as it's become known, is good for relatively short-term retentions of relatively exam-type knowledge. If that's your overriding goal, then that's a reasonable way of teaching. It's not ineffective. But if you also care about the development of collaboration, of intuition, of imagination, of self-rescuing, of resilience, of curiosity, if those are also on your list of valued outcomes, then it's far less clear that explicit teaching is the optimal pedagogy. And so it's up to us, isn't it? It's up to us in terms of what we value, to be first very clear about that, and only then start making decisions about the optimal forms of pedagogy. So I think I was going to, no, I can't do this. Can I do this here? Rather than throw more text at you, but I will very quickly read these. So these are like the sort of the take-home messages, perhaps, that you might want to argue with if I leave enough time for Q&A. The learning sciences is a hybrid, multi-perspectival and unfolding discipline. There's no single agreed science of learning. Even if there were, it wouldn't tell us how to teach without a clear specification of what we're teaching for. Good teaching, quote, involves a constantly changing balance of framing, explaining, and exploring. It's a dynamic environment in which the actual pedagogy that you're using at any moment will be changing and will be multiple, will be evolving in response to what's going on in the classroom world. The development of valued traits such as perseverance, independence, collaboration require escalating levels of challenge, autonomy, and exploratory talk. That begins to emerge as the part of the blueprint for what an epistemic apprenticeship would begin to look like. To judge this escalation right, you have to know your students well as a group and individually. You can't just treat them as a batch of 12-year-olds are all similar for all relevant purposes. Learning, thinking, and behaving intelligently cannot be properly understood apart from matters of personality, emotion, conviviality, the specific nature of the challenge, and the social context in which you find yourself. And, as I said earlier, I'll come back to that point, science and maths are not necessarily, I don't think, not necessarily at all, valid prototypes of all school learning. Mind is organic and ecological, not computational. Learning naturally grows out of what is already known. Mind is a tree, not a computer. The fundamental driver of learning is the urge to derive accurate predictions from experience that will guide future action, not to stockpile explicit knowledge. Useful though that is ancillary to our fundamental learning design. Cognition is enhanced by culturally derived and socially transmitted upgrades and sometimes reduced by downgrades. Predictive processing, social and affective neuroscience, and embodied cognition support wider purposes of education and point towards possible pedagogies that involve emotion, autonomy, inquiry, and interthinking. School as an epistemic apprenticeship, just my example for the purposes of this lecture, cultivating positive epistemic upgrades and avoiding downgrades is therefore something wantable, something that it's reasonable to think about, and practicable is a wantable and practical goal, but it challenges the many of the educational shibboleths and will of course have its opponents. And I'll finish with one of my favorite quotes from Machiavelli. There is nothing more perilous to conduct or more certain of its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, exam boards, publishers, and so on, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new, but who do not readily believe in new things until they've had long experience of them. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lindsay Oates. I'm the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Education. We have time for a couple of questions, so thank you for your very comprehensive presentation. If you have a question, please stand up and we'll run the microphone to you. And while we're doing that, I'm going to ask you a
here's one I prepared earlier.
Prepared question. University is a place where we come to talk about ideas, and we don't always agree on our ideas, but we hope that the university is a great place where we can explore respectfully our different ideas. A question I have for you, in your long, distinguished career, what's something that people have consistently misunderstood in your work? Not necessarily which people have disagreed with, but something that you wish they understood so they could make an informed opinion on whether to agree or not.
I think that's probably a long, maybe it's like, I'll get back to you on that type question. The immediate answer is just, I think, being pigeonholed as a progressive is being forced into this tug-of-war idea that, there are two camps jostling for ascendancy in the educational world. And I tried to make clear at the beginning of the talk that I refuse to take the bait on that. I think it's not accurate and it's not helpful. It's not clever and it's not funny, as my mum used to say, to try and force us into that competitive view. And I've sometimes suffered from being thus boxed.
Okay. Thank you. Question? Yep, we got one up the back in the middle there.
Hello, Guy. I have been a fan of you for like 20 years, so it's so cool to see you. Thank you. Hello. I just wonder about your beautiful work that's been so important to mine around possibility thinking and creativity, the work with the late Anna Kraft. The sciences of learning for me as an art and design educator usually refuse to include us. And so I'm excited to see, I thought you might have turned to the dark side when I saw the name for tonight. What is the place for us in here? Because in schools we are removed from this thinking, our embodied cognition you speak about tonight that we bring into creative classrooms doesn't seem to exist in the rhetoric that I hear around contemporary schooling, and the numbers across the country are falling in my field because principals and schools are reducing our numbers day by day. And so what do you, someone who I've turned to, continuously in scholarship, what do you have to say about that as we, have lost over 40 courses in arts education in the tertiary sector because of these sciences of learning, and we continue to lose teachers in schools because principals are reducing what it means to do English, maths and science teaching and reduce the arts?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. That's a reflection of the continuing hegemony, is that the right word, of the intellect, isn't it? Of a narrow conceptualization of intellect. The arts get phased out by people who find the elusiveness and challenging nature of the arts inconvenient. That's one. I mean, that's happening in America at the moment. I think we need to get to the first part of my new book that I'm writing jointly with Emily Pohl is a kind of meditation on why educational reform so often goes backwards and why it's often so patchy. Our catchy title for the chapter is "We've had 100 years of educational reform and schools are getting worse." Things flare up and then they dissipate. We get excited about the Melbourne Declaration, and 18 years later, much of the juice and the essence and the innovation and the commitment of that declaration seems to have got diffused in what was to become the Australian curriculum, if I read it rightly. But obviously, it's very important. The arts are extremely important as ways of broadening our conception of what are the family, what's the suite of ways of knowing which enable us to be optimally intelligent in our everyday lives. And I think I had a very interesting conversation this afternoon. Where's Peter Duffy, who's visiting? Did I see a hand? There he is, not far away from you, who was just telling me about some fascinating research of his on infusing drama across the curriculum. So have a word with your colleague up the back there. Thanks for the question.
We'll take one more question, right up the back. And maybe if you could stand up, that'd be great, please.
Hello, thank you so much. I wanted to ask how you think the essentially kind of unilateral compulsory nature of education that we have here and in the UK and in the US in similar settings, how does that affect our ability to and our impetus to ask for what? Do we have room in systems like these for multiple for whats? Does that compulsory sort of straight across the board, does that discourage us from asking for what?
Asking so what? Was that your question?
For what? As in what is the purpose of or the intent for education?
Do you mean, I'm not quite clear. It's like, well, the first thing that popped into my mind was a teacher friend of mine who gives every member of her class at the beginning of each term a joker, like the joker from a pack of cards. And they have one opportunity to play their joker at any point during that term, and when the child plays the joker, that is a demand that the teacher stops what she's doing and explains the real life validity of what she's doing. It's not a bad idea, is it? Yeah? So install that and see how things go.
Great. Okay, thank you for your questions. It's my great honour to now invite Professor Sandra Milligan from Melbourne Metrics Faculty of Education for a vote of thanks. So Guy, if you want to stay there or sit down, it's up to you. Yeah, come and sit.
Professor Claxton, Guy, thank you very much for that. It's my great honour to be able to give a vote of thanks, and I'm sort of stuck for words, to be honest. I've been taking copious notes and trying to figure out what I would say in response, and I haven't really had a chance to read people's faces to see what they think, but I did a quick straw poll around where I was sitting, and I've heard best Dean's lecture ever. Terrific, this is exactly what we need, and I'm reflecting back to why I thought that Guy originally would be a great speaker for us in Australia at this particular time in our educational thinking. And I think Guy actually said it. He said that there could be a hegemony of narrow conceptions of the intellect that appeal to the science of learning for their arguments. Now, that's where I was coming from. And I thought that getting Guy, who clearly has been working in this area all his life and has a huge corpus of scholarship behind him, might illuminate for at least me, and I know many of my colleagues are here, others, about where we're up to and where we should think about it. I love new phrases, Guy, and although I know your work reasonably well, I've picked up a whole pile of new ideas tonight. So people are going to hear me talking about epistemic apprenticeships and things like anti-elementitis. I really like that one. It's really terrific. Cold cognition versus warm cognition. These are all terrifically powerful ideas, captured in a little phrase, I know, but we can thread them out. I really felt as well that you gave me, at least, some new ways to think about some old problems, like the idea that you catch cognition and epistemological positions with the people you hang out with. And I mean, that was a really powerful idea for me, and I've been wondering why I dislike the segmentation that's happening in Australian society and schooling. I've now got one of the sciences of learnings to appeal to tell me why I didn't like that. So thank you very much. So I don't know exactly what everyone thought. My sense is that we're feeling very grateful to you, Guy, to share us with this, and that it's just a shame it's not a seminar rather than a lecture. What I think is that people will have taken as much as I did, which is a great deal out of what you said, for their own purposes. And, my hope, the thing that really struck me, for those who are teachers and principals in the room, Guy said that the sciences of learnings don't tell us what to do. And yet all of the things he was talking about are the things that teachers and principals grapple with every day. And to reduce the art and the craft of teaching to some limited theoretical positions in one stream of the learning sciences, I think is a great danger. So I hope, this is my real hope, that the teachers and principals in the room will have felt empowered to use some of the things in the sciences of learning to be bold and think what our purposes of education are and how's the best way to get them. So that's a bit of a passionate plea for them, so for me. So Guy, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and can you show Guy?
Well, thank you so much, and I would like to just echo Sandra's sentiments and to extend my own sincere thanks to Guy for that compelling, thought-provoking lecture and for the audience discussion. And thanks also to Professor Lindsay Oates for really expertly facilitating tonight's Q&A. And this concludes our event tonight. Please keep an eye out for news of our next Dean's lecture. That's going to be, again, the best one ever. And please sign up to our mailing list. Thank you so much, and travel home safely.